So there's been a lot of talk in the last 2 weeks about the shortage of healers that there is in Party Finder in the current tier in Final Fantasy XIV. And I thought this was news from 2 weeks ago, but apparently it's this week's news too, because this is still something I'm seeing people talk about on Reddit even today. And so before I go on and I start talking about why there is a shortage of healers in Party Finder and what's there to do about it, I do need to talk about my credentials. I only recently have finished the Endwalker MSQ in 6.2 and gotten into the high-end content and started progging Stormcrown's Extreme, so I'm only just scratching the surface with Final Fantasy XIV's endgame. So this video is very much going to be from the perspective of someone who is a WoW veteran who is looking at this from the outside in, who is just getting their feet wet in Final Fantasy XIV. And this video is going to be a little bit lower energy than usual. And the reason why that is because I'm recording this video at night, and I usually record my videos first thing in the morning. I'll wake up, I'll grab my coffee, I'll sit down, and I'll record. But right now it's pitch black outside. It's 7 p.m. and I am exhausted. And so this is going to be a little bit lower energy, a little bit more intimate. And so the first thing I kind of want to say about this is that there is a perception in the community that there is a problem with healing because the mobs and the bosses do more damage and thus increasing the healing requirements in the current tier. Now, the reason why I said that there is a perception of the community is because it's the perception of the community that dictates player behavior more than the reality. Am I saying that it's not true that there is more healing requirements and more damage done by the bosses in this tier? No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that it's probably true. However, I am saying that it's also true that there is a perception that that is the case, and it is the perception that really shapes human behavior more. And if you look at what happens in World of Warcraft and the kind of problems that this can create, is that there are the high-end players, the raiders, the people who, do the highest-end content and do it full-time. And they come up with some perceptions. For example, they might say something like, this current tier, White Mage is S tier, while, Scholar is D tier. And that perception might very well be true at the highest end of play. But what happens when that perception then trickles down into the rest of the community, because, it's natural that the rest of the community will look up to the highest end raiders and the highest end players for advice on how to go ahead and clear the content that they play professionally. It's only natural that they're going to, adopt these opinions and parrot them around, that this perception then trickles down to the rest of the community. And what's true at the highest end isn't always translatable to the lower end. So although it might be true, for in World of Warcraft Max, Limit Max, or in Final Fantasy XIV, someone like Xeno, that, a certain job is like way outperforming another job, that difference might not be noticed as much in the middle tier when there's a lot more, room for error, or there's a lot more people making mistakes. And so that's the first thing I want to say, that perception really can shape reality. And that also isn't to say that it's not true. It is very much likely that it's true that the healing requirements are too high and the damage being done is too high. And so then that leads into my next point. What does that mean for the fights? And what you've heard from a lot of healers, what I heard from Cole Enix and what I've read on Reddit, is a lot of healers are actually enjoying the current tier. They're having fun. They like this tier. And they do not want Square Enix to make healing any less fun. And so they've also then gone on to say that the biggest problem with the current tier is that because it's so challenging, it requires tanks and DPS to then use their mitigation properly and effectively. And that in many cases, the healers are running into situations where a squishy isn't using their mitigation, causing them to die. Or that, DPS and tanks aren't mitigating, thus forcing them to, cast their GCD heals and, bring down uptime on doing damage. And this is what's creating a lot of problems for the healers. It's not that they're not having fun. And it's just that, they are not feeling like tanks and DPS, probably DPS in particular, especially the squishy DPS, are not dependable. And this is something I totally understand. And the reason why I understand this is because I am a black mage main. It feels like shit walking out of my ley lines. It feels like shit losing my astral fire. It feels horrible. And so it takes discipline for me. It does. It takes discipline for me to maybe, move out of the mechanic instead of trying to, just get that cast off right before I move. I do it as I try to do it as much as I can, but I do recognize that like mitigating is not something I'm used to. And when you're playing DPS, you get in this mindset of pump, 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 pump. My parses, that's kind of the mindset you get into, even if you're not parsing. You want to do damage. That's why you pick the DPS job, right? That's what happens. And so, DPS aren't used to having to mitigate because in previous tiers, it appears that there was not as much of a requirement in extreme content, maybe even in savage content, for DPS to have to mitigate and for tanks to have to mitigate as much as they have to now. But it's become almost a requirement, if not a full-fledged requirement in some of the current tiers content for tanks and for DPS to go ahead and use their mitigation. And so then that leaves Yoshi P and Square Enix with two options. On one end, they can, decrease the healing requirements and the necessity for mitigation to be done as effectively as it's required to be done right now. Alternatively, what Square Enix and Yoshi P can do is they can keep things the way they are and have people complain about this problem. Both of these come with their pros and cons. So if Square Enix goes ahead and they keep things the way they are, what would happen is that there would continue to be a shortage of healers in Party Finder, which would then force the tanks and the DPS to learn how to mitigate, to then incentivize people to go ahead and join the Party Finder, right? So it's almost like, are you going to rise up to the occasion or not? Are you going to be a little bitch and ask for a nerf, or are you going to figure it the fuck out? And, Blizzard has taken this approach with WoW before. There's been plenty of times throughout WoW's history where the community's like, oh my God, this is too hard. And Blizzard's like, oh, well, especially early on, like in TBC, oh, well, figure it out, dog. And I think there's a fulfillment and a joy to be found in that because, eventually the problem would work itself out. If DPS wants to do the raid, they're going to have to learn how to mitigate. So then there's an incentive for healers to want to do it. And, this would create a situation where there is a short-term complaint, but in the long term, it will create for a more fulfilling raiding environment. And it'll create for a more a feeling of accomplishment and fulfillment from the game in the long run. Now, alternatively, what can happen is Square Enix goes ahead and they make it so there are less healing requirements and there is less damage being done by the mobs and the bosses in the current tier. And if Square Enix goes with that approach, then what would happen is as the tier goes on, the fights are going to become more and more solved. And this is particularly true for Final Fantasy XIV, since fights are a lot more scripted, whereas in a game like World of Warcraft, fights are a lot more improv. You've heard the analogy that WoW raids and WoW raid fights are like jazz improv, whereas raiding in Final Fantasy XIV is like playing classical piano because it's a lot more rigid, it's a lot more structured, and that's not a bad thing. It's just the way that the game is designed. And so as time goes on in the current tier, the fight becomes more and more solved. Tanks become better at doing the fight. DPS becomes better at doing the fight. And once that happens, it makes it so that there is less need for healers. There's less need for people to go in and go ahead and, really struggle and have a hard time and get that fun, fulfilling experience from having to heal in a challenging way. And if that occurs, then you'll run into an issue where people also aren't healing because it's just not fun to heal because it's not challenging to heal. So, this is kind of the problem you run into. Do you give in to the community and you make things easier so then people can clear and be happy in the short term, but then make it so that in the long run, the healers aren't having fun? Or do you create a situation where melee and tanks need to rise up to the occasion and mitigate properly and get out of their comfort zones? Listen, and I'm talking as from the perspective of a black mage who also doesn't mitigate well. I am foremost most guilty of this, okay? I'm not here to proselytize. And they do that, and they force tanks and melee to rise to the occasion. So then healers now have more incentive to join Party Finder. I think that's the move, and I hope that's the move that they take. And knowing the history of Square Enix and Yoshi P, I'm betting that that's the move that they're going to take, and this is something that's going to solve itself, later on in the tier. And that's all I had to say for this video. We'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.